This phylogenetic tree shows the current classification of all life on Earth. So this would be the entire tree of life. And this has changed a lot over time. So originally, we classified things as either plants or animals, which didn't make a lot of sense because there's a ton of stuff that doesn't really fit in either of those groupings. Later in the 1960s, we started to classify things into what was called the Five Kingdom system. So this had a kingdom for prokaryotes called Monera. So Monera would have included all of these prokaryotes over here. And then the other four kingdoms that you're more familiar with, which would be animals, fungus, plants, and then protists. And the protists would have been all of these things in black up here: tubulinids, green algae, ciliates. And you can see how they're kind of spread all over the place. That's what I meant by they're a polyphyletic grouping. But this doesn't make any sense. So the kingdom of Protista, and I'm doing air quotes when I say Protista, it's not a real kingdom anymore. The kingdom of Protista included organisms that were more closely related to fungus and animals than each other. So the foraminins are not very closely related to the algae. The algae are more closely related to plants. These tubulinids are more closely related to fungus and animals. So it didn't make sense to group all of these into the kingdom of Protista. So instead, now what's mostly accepted, and this was started in about the 1990s, is the three-domain system. So there's the domain bacteria, which contains most of the bacteria that you would be familiar with, and sometimes we say this is also going to contain the kingdom Eubacteria. There's the domain Archaea, which is going to contain bacteria that live in kind of extreme places, in extreme weathers and extreme conditions. So these aren't going to be the kind of bacteria that you find on your desk. And both of these are a clade. So domain Archaea, this is a clade, common ancestor, all descendants. Domain Bacteria, this is a clade, the most recent common ancestor, and then all of the descendants. And then domain Eukarya is another clade, and this is going to include the most recent common ancestor of all eukaryotes. And then, so domain Eukarya is also a clade. This is going to include the most recent common ancestor of all eukaryotes, and then all of the groups that come off of that. And there are actually four main groupings that come off, and they branch here like this in what's called a polytomy, because we don't know which ones branch off first. We have not figured that out. There's the euglenozoans up here, the phoriums, diatoms, ciliates. This makes another grouping. We've got the grouping here of algae and plants, and then another grouping here with the tubulinids, the fungus, and the animals. So fungus and animals are actually more closely related to each other than they are to plants, and this is going to make up the four large groups that we'll see when we start to look at Protista, the protists. And this three-domain system, where each domain is a clade, is supported by lots of genetic evidence. In early life on Earth, and even currently now, there's a phenomenon called horizontal gene transfer. Horizontal movement is not your typical movement of genes from ancestor to descendant. Remember endosymbiosis? So endosymbiosis would have been how we took a bacterial cell and put those genes into a eukaryotic cell. So that's an example of horizontal gene transfer. So it kind of engulfing that mitochondria, engulfing those chloroplasts. But there's a lot of other ways to transfer genes between not related organisms, like plasmids. So a lot of bacteria can share pieces of DNA. Viral infections, so if a virus grabs a piece of DNA and takes it to another organism through the infection of whatever virus vector. And we don't know how the horizontal gene transfers went on in early life, in early bacterial